Hello everyone. Welcome to our discussion on creating narrative experiences in a strategy game as part of the TactiCon event of 2022. And we'll do a quick introduction run to know who's who and who's doing what. Then we'll dive into the subject of the day or the evening, depending on where you are. And I can start myself. So I am Jaakko from Kalla Gameworks in Finland, and we are working on the Pegasus Expedition, which is a sci-fi 4X grand strategy game that is story-driven, like heavily story-driven. So we are attempting combining the more traditional 4X gameplay with like actual character-driven storytelling and see what happens.
Hello, I'm Layla Johnson. I'm creative director and CEO at Mohawk Games. We are behind two titles, Off-World Trading Company. It's an RTS, economic RTS, and currently Old World, which is a historical PC strategy game. It's also historically driven. It's not a historical simulator, but there's a good balance between narrative and mechanics.
Hey, I'm Kyle Kukshtel, lead developer and creative director at Afterschool Studio. We're currently working on Cantata, which is a grand tactics sci-fi strategy game, kind of inspired by games like Advance Wars, but at the scale of something like Civilization or Total War. And similarly, like strongly narrative driven, but in a slightly different way than I think Jaakko or Layla's games are, as well as Jackson's. So we can talk about that too.
Yeah. Hi, y'all. I'm Jackson Wagner. I'm lead QA and design at Worldwalker Games. We made Wildermyth, tactical turn-based RPG with myth-making elements. It's kind of fantasy XCOM, very heavy narrative base mixed with tactical combat.
Hello, everyone. And then I thought I would like to start with a question that I heard quite a few times when talking about strategy games and narrative experiences. And the question is, why? Why would we want to do that? And do you think it's a good idea? I think you probably do because you're doing it. But why did you choose to include a narrative experience or narrative aspects in your own game or games?
So I know for Wildermyth, it was always kind of the story came first and the tactics came second. And the kind of base idea was having these procedurally generated heroes that would interact with each other in new and interesting ways every time you played through a story. And the big idea was, okay, we want you to care about these characters so that when one of them dies in combat, it's not a mechanical loss of, oh no, I lost my best warrior. At least it's not just that. It's, oh no, I lost, the guy I've had with me for this entire game who's in love with this character. How are they going to react to that? And so having stories that kind of the gameplay supported was really important to us starting out. And so we felt that, like, to that question, just why would we want to do that? Because tactics can be really interesting, but it doesn't have to be this kind of cold, pure numbers game. And that by having a narrative drive to it, it can make even, turn-based combat, which for a lot of people is kind of like wait and doesn't have a lot of tension. We can really enhance the tension because if you care about these people, you don't want them to die. And it's kind of that simple. But yeah.
For Old World, we wanted a narrative to add a little bit of spice to the 4X experience. And because we needed some kind of randomness to change the game flow. So why not writing all sorts of events that can leave it up to the player to choose the outcome and change the flow of the game. And of course, we wanted also people to feel strong connection to the characters. And when we started with designing the narrative for Old World, we didn't imagine that the narrative is going to be as big as it turned out to be and being part of the gameplay. Also, we wanted a little bit of a different experience from Civilization. Our lead designer, Soren Johnson, is behind the game Civilization 4, Civilization 3. But what we wanted to do with Old World is we wanted to create a stronger connection to characters, which is very hard to do with immortal leaders like in Civilization.
Yeah, for Cantata, it's sort of similar to what Layla's talking about. Cantata comes from, it's definitely this lineage of sort of tacticsy games that are often at the scale of Wildermyth, but we kind of expand the game to be the scale of a whole map. So some of our more like kindred cousins are like traditional historical war games that you would see at like Slytherin or stuff like that. But those games are so often have a implied historical setting just because of the context in which the game takes place. And I know, Layla, you guys kind of mess with that a little bit as well based on your setting. But for us, because we didn't have that root, so much of what we had to do is to say, okay, if you've got a line of, 60 sci-fi tanks or something, what is the like kind of narrative significance of that? And so without being able to have a specific framework that we're operating in, right? Like we haven't actually had space battles in real history, part of us had to come up with that sort of narrative to kind of justify that sort of setting. So the game started from a narrative perspective, and we knew that we wanted to go to this tactics place, but we kind of had to thread the needle from that like impetus such that by the time you actually get to the moment of sitting down to play, you're like, okay, these are these people, this is why they're here, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just like sort of an abstract game of chess that has like no context inside of it.
Yeah, going off of what Layla said a little bit, that was just another thing that we wanted with Wildermyth is that in the game, your heroes do age and eventually retire, and they pass the mantle to their kids, and that was really important because it can feel kind of disconnecting if you're running these immortal heroes who don't get frail, or they kind of ignore the ravages of time, and we really wanted that element not only for the kind of fun stuff that came later of like, oh, how do a parent and child interact when they're adventuring together, but understanding that, okay, you have to be okay with this hero going on, and this is the end of their story, whether they died in battle or whether they're just retiring. You need to find a way to work with it. And so it was both a really important narrative point for us and also a mechanical one of, okay, you need to go into this full campaign knowing that at some point your strongest warrior, he's going to go away, and maybe he teaches the new folks something to kind of ease that pain, but it's going to happen, and you need to kind of plan for that.
Yeah, definitely. For also the gameplay, from a gameplay perspective, we had this. You build diplomacy with, for example, Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, but you know that Alexander is going to be his heir. So you're always given this narrative of like, should I start building with my relationship with Alexander, or kind of stay with Philip? What if he just dies all of a sudden? So it just adds this layer of complexity, is also fun. And gives it some realism. Like, I think it's closer to how people did diplomacy, with just creating that type of bond with characters.
Yeah, we are doing 4X game as well. So when you Leila mentioned the like how it can give spice to the experience, the whole idea for our game started with a group of 4X game fans. We were thinking that we love all these games, but we would like to go a bit deeper with the immersion in a single campaign, because generally, because in these games you can play with many factions, so there's not super much like a story effort for a single faction. So we thought that what if we try to doing it the way that we have only one faction, and we put absolutely all the effort in having immersive experience with that one faction and one playthrough. So that's what we are trying. And also we thought it could help with the problem with the grand strategy and 4X games sometimes have that the campaign becomes a bit stagnant, and the player starts to feel that, okay, I have actually kind of won this thing already, so maybe I should quit this playthrough and start a new campaign. So we thought that if we have an overarching story that keeps throwing new stuff at the player, we could like keep hold of them in the same playthrough for longer, or at least that's what we hope.
This is sort of like a sort of special thing about Cantata, especially I think in terms of our scale, we have like much more sort of kin with like the Total War and the 4X people like you all. And what's weird about the Cantata and sort of the way we do narrative is that I think that both Layla and Jaakko, your games especially, have this like context where you have seeds of the experience inside the game that produce sort of procedural outcomes that are kind of interesting to deal with. And I know like Jackson, obviously Wildermyth, that's like the whole premise of the game. For us, it's like we have this sort of large strategy, but the actual campaign is like totally authored. So there's no like the deviating moments of the campaign are about sort of moment to moment battles and encounters, but like you're not going to change the arc of the main campaign story. So we're so much more focused on like kind of writing and authoring a narrative inside of a large strategic framework versus trying to like um, kind of imbue like individual units or moments with this like huge thing because all told the price story of Cantata is like 8 months or something, whereas like I think Old World is like 200 years, maybe 150 years. I don't know about Pegasus Expedition, and obviously with kids and grandparents dying and Wildermyth, it's also decades long. So it's a weird thing to sort of see like the kind of the timeline in which a strategy game is, like targeting kind of necessitates some of the storytelling tools that you use to tell those stories because I don't think that any of our stuff would really graft onto the other games necessarily well because the span of history changes. So like yeah, if you're playing history, like being able to politic with Alexander doesn't make sense in Civilization 4 because Alexander will be around for like 2 turns and then he's gone. But if you're playing a game that has a focus of history in which Alexander's reign is like meaningful over the course of like, some percentage of the game, the engagement with that character matters. And if you zoom in even more, you're so close to day-to-day lives where engaging with a larger entity like Alexander wouldn't make sense because it's this, pie in the sky thing. So yeah.
I've always found that to be kind of interesting. I had a professor who told me that, in US history, if you're trying to guess the year that something happened, you need to be really like within 5 years or else you're way off. But in world history, as long as you're within like a century, you're close enough, more or less. And so I feel like that kind of applies to games too, in a way of, okay, if you are telling, if you're telling these grand stories, it can be really difficult, especially if you're trying to use historical figures that maybe they didn't live that long, trying to figure out how to work that in, and also just how to make a time period feel meaningful, no matter what the grand scale of it is in the end.
Yeah, actually, the next subject I was planning on touches this heavily. So I thought we could discuss about that. And now you may disagree with me. This is just my opinion, but I feel like narrative experiences can be put on a line where, in one end, we have the pure emergent storytelling, and on the other end, we have the completely written and curated experience, like Carl, you just described that your game seems to be heavily on this end. So I was going to ask that, apart from do you agree with me in this, is that where does your game lie on this line, and why did you think that's the perfect place for your game?
I'll just pick it up because I feel like I'm on the far end of the spectrum from everybody else, which is that the core campaign of Cantata, like I said, is like it's very authored. It's literally like it's not procedurally generated. It's like handmade levels, and there's 9 of them, and then each of them takes we say 2 to 3 hours, but somehow in early access, people have played our game for like hundreds of hours already. So like clearly there's more there than we thought, or like strategy games take longer than we anticipate to play, which I think everyone can probably commiserate with. Um, but I think like in light of that, right? Like part of the beauty of strategy games is that you want to have like they are kind of fundamentally or should be sort of fundamentally creative in a way where you are making decisions that impact gameplay. So a lot of the sort of so in contrast to like a strictly like linear narrative character action game in which you're kind of like literally moving along a path, we try to basically give the player tools in the context of the map that allow them to have emergent experiences. So like the goal of a map will probably be like get over here and like kill this unit or whatever, and that's not really going to change. But the way you get there can be different. And so that comes from, that emerges out of mechanics, which is to say, there's we have limits on how many things you can build inside of specific regions. There's not a correct thing to build. There's different ways to kind of set up your resource chains. There's different ways you can produce certain units. And additionally, like on the maps themselves, we kind of I think of them sort of more like tabletop RPG maps where there is like a critical path where it's like, yes, if you go from here to here, you will find the end and you can theoretically win. We put all this other stuff on the map So your experience of that map will kind of vary based on if you take a left or a right here, and you might encounter this thing that has some like, cool thing or whatever. So we try to make that experience of traversal really interesting, such that it does feel and is like a decision. But then at like the unit level, we're looking at we do stuff like units themselves have like levels that give them perks, that give them different bonuses. So and you can like name your units too. So like if you have 6 different units, they'll have different levels of veterancy. And then that sort of like that group of units becomes this like gestalt in your mind of like, okay, these people have lasted through that other battle over here, so they like mean more to me. I named this character this thing, so like now all of a sudden there's this kind of knock-on narrative effect where all these mechanics at a small level produce, you know, creative decisions about those specific units despite acting inside of a largely linear framework. So that's how we are kind of like on this very narrative side, but also give you enough tools that you can kind of play something and not feel like it's the exact same or there's one way to do it for every time you run through it.
So I thought I'd pick up from here, as I think I'm next on the line, maybe not as far as you, but close, because we thought that we could, but because we want to put our effort and ammunition on that one playthrough, we thought that we'd like get a better experience on with that angle if we actually have a pretty created story as well. So Pegasus Expedition has one overarching storyline, which is not going to save much because, well, it's about saving Earth, and you either do that or you don't do that, but that's pretty absolute thing. But then we like about half of the story content is like side quests or stuff that you can either ignore or pick up, and then if you pick it up, then you can like resolve it in various ways. And in that sense, the whole experience has like half curated and half with choices, but still there's not terribly much branching to like keep the quality and amount of content high enough. So I'd say like maybe 80% curated and 20% emergent. There are some textbook events that come up when the player does something, and of course, because it's a grand strategy game, the player has their fleets and admirals, and they gain experience, and then they tragically die after a long career, and so on. So that's happening as well. But that's what we decided to do.
Yeah, so I guess for where Wildermyth lies, it feels like it can change a little bit based on how, like, degree the overarching narrative of most of the campaigns is it's set in stone from the beginning. There's the first campaign, without spoiling anything, there's a Gorgon named Ulstrix who's trying to do something awful to the world. That's not really something the players have control over. But within that overarching narrative, there are these, basically whenever they travel to a new area, a new event will pop up, and within that, they most of the time get to make a choice that will have some result that will leave a lasting mark on their hero. And kind of beyond that, there are times where the heroes themselves will fall into relationships that will then cause certain other events to show up where they wouldn't have if there was no one in a relationship. So it does feel like we're kind of right there in the middle a little bit.
We have a little bit in common with Wildermyth in that aspect, but I think that we are about like 100% random. You do start like from the get-go with a leader that you choose, and you start the same way every time. But then as soon as you hit end a turn, you almost will never play the same game twice. I think today we have reached about over 3,500 events. And we try to borrow a lot of stories from actual histories that happened in the world and write them into the game, creating an option for the player to choose exactly what happened in history, and that would continue leading. Like, we break up the story into multiple little stories, and they can eventually get to the same result that happened in actual history. But then there are so many other options that will lead you somewhere else. So I feel like the game, we on purpose chose this for the player because we wanted the player to have a different experience, regardless of the fact that they might choose the same civilization, the same leader, try to aim to play the same game, they're almost not almost, they're definitely not going to play the same game twice. So I think we're on the other extreme of things. We're probably 100% random.
That was something that 3,500 events for in Wildermyth terms, I'm like, that's insane. But I know totally different games.
I wrote them all in one night.
Our writer would weep to hear it. No, that's the thing we also wanted with Wildermyth is it was a matter of no. We're a small team. This isn't something we can't make a huge amount of these, but what we can do is within each comic, the dialogue changes based on the personality traits of the heroes you're bringing along. So even though you will run into some of the same events, your heroes will react to it differently. And in some cases, they might have, a tree arm or a flame arm that will then give you a little different option that appears. And so, yeah, that same idea of even if you're playing through the same overarching story, we really want it to feel like a different experience as best we can. So yeah, that was another goal of ours.
Yeah,
I remember. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember this event. I don't know if you saw him. I had the puppy earlier, but I remember he's not leaving me be. So I'm just gonna show you my new puppy. He's right here. His name is Julius.
Oh, so cute.
Awesome.
So we wrote an event about a pet monkey, and it became so popular that we had to write so many different varying options for them not to have not to know what to choose every single time. So then we created a pet fish, and then we started creating more animals, and which is surprising. I thought that the players choose to play your game very differently than you think.
People love animals too. Once we had one or two pet events, people were like, "Oh, we adore these. What give us more, please." So we're like, okay, we'll do a duck one.
I started looking for animals in history, and then I was like, oh yeah, there's this Roman leader who actually chose his horse to be a council. It was totally nuts. I think it was Caligula, and we started looking for stories like this to add them to the game.
Awesome.
So, Kalla, you mentioned earlier, or talked about that, how the time frame of the game, like how long it in real time is supposed to last, kind of affects that how coherent or more like emergent story the game should have or feels like it should have. And that was a good point, because actually our game is it takes only 5 years in like real life time, because like our limitations were that okay, we're going to have a lot of characters, there's going to be a lot of dialogue, their appearance cannot change, but it's still a grand strategy game. So we took like, okay, in 5 years people don't change too much on the way they look. So that's it. Time span.
And that was something we had to kind of think about, because the first 3 campaigns we made were all kind of the standard Wildermyth. They happen over the course of like 80-ish years, 60 to 80 years, and there's basically a chapter will occur, and then there's like 10 to 12 years of peace in between. So it's kind of separating it out. It's not constant warfare or adventure. But with our 4th campaign, Aluna and the Moth, it takes place over a much, much shorter span of time. And so that was both a design and narrative challenge of, okay, we are, we're doing something completely different here. We need to figure out how to make these relationships feel, organic and grow in a realistic way while having a much shorter span of time to do that. Because normally in between chapters, we'll have, we call them tidings, and they're just kind of little notes of what your heroes are doing in their downtime, more or less. And so we found that really helped to kind of build their characters, and those were great ways of allowing the hero's personality to shine through. So, someone who is kind of peaceful might be just love walking through forests, and that would be a little tiding we'd have. But for Aluna, we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to make you care about these 5 characters in a much shorter amount of in-game time. So yeah, it makes a big difference, I think.
There was like one of the weirdest things we sort of encountered when we first started working on Cantata was like so we knew it was going to be a tactics game, or tacticsy, 4xy, grand tactics again is kind of what we're calling it. But it immediately became like an issue where, because the game is isometric if you haven't seen it before, so it's isometric tactics game. which means that any individual tile it's still 2D, but the tiles kind of exist such that they look 3D. But what happened was like we we needed maps to be big, but what we realized was that the actual like size of the things on the tiles kind of implied a time frame. So we first a long time ago we had these like canyon tiles that were sort of looked like full canyons, like you were a big like you walk by a big canyon or something, kind of like what you would see in StarCraft or whatever. But when you have like a strip of canyon tiles, like a canyon wall, and you have like one unit and you move that past that canyon, that sort of feels intuitively as a player because you're clicking one thing and moving it 5 tiles. That feels like that action maybe takes like 20 minutes. Because it's like, okay, it's a person or a tank or a ship or whatever moving by a land mass at roughly the same speed. So what that means is then if you kind of extrapolate that out, you're like, okay, well that means that everybody on the map is sort of one unit. So the kind of time frame itself is implied by the art style. And then what we did is we're like, well, actually that time frame doesn't really make sense for like the narrative of the game because you're like building buildings. And so the idea that you kind of can build a building and it takes like an hour is like weird. But so we like turned it to be where instead of walking by like canyon walls, you actually walk by like mountain tiles, like you would see in like Advance Wars or something. And then if a unit walks by a mountain tile, that feels like that actually takes like hours or days. So like you kind of you're dealing with this like abstract concept of like there's a grid has no implied sort of unit of time on it. And I think like Layla, the work that you all are doing on Old World, and then obviously what Soren did in Civilization kind of runs into the same issue where it's like, what does one unit mean? Like for Wildermyth, it's one unit is one person, right? Like you have a person, you move them across the grid, they're literally moving 5 dungeon tiles. It takes a few minutes, but like for us, it was kind of a we kind of went back and forth on like the terrain, like how dense, like if there's a forest of tiles, how big is that forest? Is a forest like 2 tiles next to each other? And that represents like a really big forest, or should it be much larger? So a lot of like the first stuff we were doing in the map was like actually trying to figure out like, well, how do we actually marry the kind of implied time frame and narrative set with the way the maps are actually designed? And when like you can kind of do whatever, but that was like a really weird thing that I wasn't sort of expecting when we knew that we weren't going to do like what Wildermyth is doing or Advanced Wars or War Group or whatever. We want to do something bigger. All of a sudden we were like, well, what do like the maps look like? And so we did. We looked at stuff like Civ, or Old World wasn't out at the time, but we looked at stuff that kind of abstracts maps away a little bit more, but it still kind of implies some passage of time through movement. So weird strategy game thing.
It is doubly weird when you're trying to kind of create a historical strategy game with ancient
Right.
leaders. As Jackson was saying earlier, when you're talking about modern American history, you have to kind of be specific within 5 years. But back in the day, you can just kind of like ballpark it around the century. And when we started with the 7 civilizations that we started with, like Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, the most ancient one, Carthage, and most ancient one being Rome, like between one and the other, you have about 1,000 years. And they're, in the game, you are going to start with the same leaders and they're contemporary, right? We also have the wonders. You have the creation of the pyramids, which is 3000 BC, to the Hagia Sophia, which is 680. But then, you have to be creative. You have to just allow yourself this creative freedom. And to be honest, players are very accepting. So you do all sorts of things, and players don't really care about that thing. As long as you are creating something that is all jammed somewhere between the classical antiquity and the bronze-ish age, then you're fine. So yeah, I don't think that the same scale works for Old World. Doesn't really make sense for us. Our tech tree alone is about 1,000 years of history, but in general, the game is about 200 years. So yeah.
Okay, here it really helps to be doing sci-fi. We just felt that moving from star to another takes 2 weeks, and no one can pull us well.
Yeah.
About maybe moving to next subject, because when somebody says narrative experience, they don't generally first think of tactical or strategy games. So now that we're all combining these two in a single game, what are the challenges, like the biggest challenges you have faced or encountered when doing this? I mean, I can give a spoiler that okay, we have had some, but if you haven't, that's awesome.
I think one of the most important things we decided, and I think I talked a little bit about this earlier, was that how in tactics games, if you have a hero that's been with you for 3 or 4 hours of real world time, losing them in one shot and them being gone hurts. It doesn't really feel great. And so with Wildermyth, we didn't really want that, because you've spent all this time investing into this character. It doesn't feel right to have them just die instantly. And so our solution was mortal wounds. And so it started off where the first time in a chapter that your hero goes to 0 health, they lose a limb. And that is, a real and visible consequence. And then if they go to 0 health again within the same chapter, then they die, because it's like, okay, you had your chance, they're going down. But yeah, so that was something we really had to kind of think about, because and after that it was like, okay, every time a hero goes to 0, losing a limb can be really punishing mechanically, because like if they're using a two-hand weapon, they just can't use the weapon anymore. And so, it's a really, really big sacrifice. And it also didn't feel right for, that to always be the same way. So now we've kind of expanded it to be, okay, the hero's scarred, maybe they got acid on them. So kind of a variety of things that are like, this is a serious thing, they need to back off. And so that was kind of our solution to what, at least in my mind, was one of the bigger problems of putting narrative in a tactics game. It's that people can die really fast, because if everyone has a lot of health, it's boring. And so, it's got to be a little dangerous, but at the same time, you don't want to lose all this progress and feel like you're left with nothing.
Yeah, we had so many different challenges, but if I were to just pick one right now, I'd say we had challenges with accuracy. We're taking this big chunk in history, and we're trying to see how close do we want to be to actual history and when. And of course, we chose to make to be how can I say this to make concessions when it comes to representation. For example, we wanted women leaders, but history isn't full or have equal amount of women leaders and men leaders. So, for example, we didn't create them. Of course, they were in history. So we just had to dig deeper to find them, and work harder to get their stories, push them forward. Like, for example, Hatshepsut, literally, her Thutmose, who came after her, tried everything he could do to bury her story. And we are digging through history to kind of give birth and strength to Hatshepsut. And we also had to think really hard about how to approach like very controversial issues like slavery. You don't want to reward slavery in games, so we had to create a series of events that eventually will lead you to a negative outcome if you keep on choosing slavery. We also had to and that was the easy one, because while it's inaccurate, it is also borrowed from history. So it has bases, it has legs in history. We made women archers just like men. We made them generals just like men. We made them priests just like men. And if we look at history, it happened. It happened rarely, but it happened. But in Old World, it's happening equally. And it's an easy decision to make for representation's sake and for a better gameplay, because how fun is it that every time you have an heir who's a girl, she just sits there and you can do nothing about it? It becomes so boring. It's the impossible gameplay.
And especially with Old World, it seems like you're already making decisions that are not necessarily following history verbatim for the sake of interest and fun. I mean, why draw the line at that? So
right.
That makes a lot.
My role was a little bit hypocritical, because I was the narrative lead, but I was also the art director for the 2D art director for Old World. So here I am looking for the special unit for the Hittite, and it is the 3-man chariot. And I go to my team and I go, okay, we need to create a 3-man chariot. And my the 3D lead artist goes, "Can we make it 2-man chariot because we can't fit it on the tile?" I'm like, "We have to be accurate." I'm like, "You hypocrite."
I know one thing for us that's like very different than I think the things that you all are dealing with, is that we had a really big issue, and I think it's still a little unresolved, which is specifically like how do you write a campaign for Cantata? I know, like, I'm at risk of like sounding very reductionist. I think for like Wilder Myth, it's like, well, here's a story here, and this happens to these people, and then you play through that story. And then Layla for Old World, it's like here's events that happen. They kind of happen in some semi-connected order, and then there's an implied narrative by the connection of those events. We're sort of in this like really weird area where you're playing a map that has a structured campaign that we want you to have some experience for while also being open. And so like we had a lot of issues early on with map design, literally sequence breaking the narrative because it's like, well, okay, so you have to go over here, but if you have a flying unit, you can just fly over there. And then now like the story's done because you reach the end. And so we had to like, and then also like the writer, when he first started writing for it, shout out to Roy, he kind of wrote the initial like campaign or two, he wrote it kind of like a tactics game. Like you would write Wilder Myth or like XCOM, where he's like, these people go here and then they see this, and then they go here and they see this, and then this happens. And it was like, dude, like we're making like a area control game. Like we can't just have the story be these people kind of walk along this path and encounter these things because the gameplay of Cantata is still happening around them. You're still capturing territory and you're building resources and supply lines, and you're running logistics networks and like all this stuff. So like how does that mesh with the story? And I don't totally think we've honestly resolved this. I think each sort of campaign does it slightly differently. I mentioned earlier before this kind of just the idea of like a tactics, or not tactics, a tabletop RPG game, but that's like sort of the best model we've come up with where when we write the scenarios now, it's more like here's the general arc, and then here's other stuff that happens, and then these can tie into those things, and then we almost like take those story bits and kind of put them on the map, ex- um, maybe somewhat designed by the writer or it's kind of designed by the map designer, and then that kind of like comes together. But it's still weird, right? Because the narrative is linear, but map traversal is, sort of non-linear. But if it's like too non-linear, then it like breaks the narrative. But if it's too linear, it doesn't feel like it's non-linear. So like just the act of like writing the story for Cantata has been really difficult. That and again, it's still difficult. Like it's not. I think we're like getting better at it, especially as we find stuff that like works or doesn't work. But yeah, literally just the like authorship, and then also just like weirdly like the structure of writing like a linear document that kind of implies this flow is very hard to translate to like a 3D space where it's like, okay, this thing was written this way, so we do all this like crazy tagging and stuff in all of our scripts to be like this audio plays here at this moment, that's over here, that's not next to this. And so yeah, that's been a huge challenge for us.
Yeah, I was going to mention two myself, and one of them is, I could say, pretty much the same as yours, but I'll say the other one first. So we wanted to tell the story of the Pegasus Expedition through characters, like with a lot of the stuff happens through with actual character interaction with the player and a bunch of either leaders of other civilizations or their own subordinates. And like our basic idea of 4X game lacked completely the way of how are we going to bring characters into this, because the player is more like a hovering camera than a person. So it like created a like council, like state council kind of situations that pop up, and then you're suddenly in a like RPG like dialogue situation. So we found a solution to that. But the other problem that Kyle sounded like you've been having too is that what basically boils down to freedom versus coherence. And we have one big galaxy that's basically free to the player to like do whatever they like in. But at the same time, we have a linear narrative, and these two things kind of conflicted with each other a lot. Because if we let the player do absolutely anything they want, then it'll be sooner or later breaking the story for sure. So then we had to little bit limit the freedom to try to keep coherence. And actually, that was the next subject I thought we could also touch upon. That if we put on a line freedom and coherence, like they are kind of conflicting with each other. And how did you solve that? Like, did you put up boundaries to the player, and what kind of boundaries did you put up to the players to stop the thing from coming apart because the player did something they absolutely should not have done yet or at all?
I'll pick it up just because I've kind of dovetailed into this. I think for us, one of the solves we did for that is like using the mechanics of the game in kind of novel ways to gate the player outside of just like landmass. Because you're sort of talking about like a traversal issue where it's like, okay, well, you could just turn around and go that direction and like reach the narrative beat or whatever. So something that we tried to do is that like the game is built to be very moddable, such that like almost everything can be modded by players, like with our like editor in the game, including kind of specific properties of regions that are on the map, like territory. And so what we do is that I think there are some maps where we literally have like, hard boundaries where there's like water between, like in chapter 1, the first map, it's kind of like a little U shape. So at one point there was an issue where the land, and you kind of go like this like C shape. There's an issue where like if you built something at the very top of the peninsula at the start location, you could actually spawn a unit across the water at the final location. And then, so like there's solves like that where we had to like draw more water. So you like can't do that. But then other stuff is like saying, okay, well, like, so we effectively need to slow the player down. And one way to do this with like traversal stuff, but the other way was like, okay, well, we're not actually going to give you the stuff that allow you to do the things to break the game at that point. So that's like, okay, in the tech tree, if they get a flying unit, it should probably come later, and we should anticipate the fact that they'll have a flying unit by that time. Or like, we'll have it where the first 2 regions you start in, you like can't build stuff in. So you just move through them and you can't actually build buildings, but you're still moving through the maps. You are still progressing the narrative. Um, and then we have this whole kind of like complex trigger system you can like work with to kind of trigger events and stuff in all these special ways. And so those will kind of pop off and like grant you things that will kind of give you or like knock down kind of like soft gates that we've set up to make it so that you can't kind of like break the experience for yourself. But I'm sure if there's a very enterprising player, of which there are definitely very enterprising players, they could very easily just break the maps. But for us, at the end of the day, right, it's like we're trying to give you a narrative experience. If you want to break that, that's like your own prerogative.
Yeah. That's,
yeah.
That's something that's come up so often in discussion is like, okay, the players could break this if they really want to. Is that okay? Like, if we made it hard enough and they're still doing it, should we just kind of let them? Well, that's you can definitely do that in a way in Wildermyth, but when it comes to the progression, it is very much hard gated. And like the first chapter, the map is going to be pretty small. It's maybe 5 or 6 tiles, which means 5 or 6 events roughly. And then second chapter, the fog of war, quote unquote, kind of spans out, and the map continues to grow up until the 5th chapter when it's a big map. And at that point, you probably have more than 5 heroes who you can send around to kind of take on different tasks. And so when it comes to that kind of like span of freedom versus kind of narrative, for us, the places where we give the player freedom are when the events show up and then they have a choice they can make. And that's their little, they have that to choose from, and then they can choose where, what tile to go to first. And, some events do lead off of each other. So, oh, you got this event. Okay, that means there's a chance that this one will show up later on. And that is something that was actually a little bit difficult, leading back to talking about kind of how the map plays into it, is that it doesn't make sense to have an event that takes place in a forest when you're exploring a mountain tile. And so we had to go through this process of being like, okay, we have a bunch of events for mountain tiles, swamp tiles, but because of the way the game works, they spawn less frequently than like forest or plain tiles. So how do we make it so that the players still get to see these events that we worked hard on, and in that way it helps keep the experience fresh while also keeping the environment the way we want it to look. So yeah, kind of balancing that. We want it to be interesting for the player, and that means not letting them see everything all the time.
Yeah, we have a similar experience to yours, Jackson, and yours, Kyle, in many ways. We have triggers for if they are in the mountains and an event comes up, or the series of events that have that as a trigger. We have triggers that are related to traits and a leader, a memory. We create memory with their heirs, with their families, with their spouses, with different leaders of different nations, and we have all sorts of triggers. But I must say that we give the player a lot of freedom. So on top of giving them options in the events, we also let them choose the role-playing mode where they can, for example, one of the inspirations for us creating Old World was a lot of board games. Sora and I just play board games maybe daily. And one of them was Arabian Nights. So you're just kind of walking around, oops, you encounter a genie says blank to you, and then you have to choose one of the answers. And we gave that player the same type of experience. They can choose not to know the consequences. They can choose one of the 3, 4, 5, 2 options we give them. And they can get to know what's going to happen. They can choose to know what's going to happen. They can choose not to know and play it like the board game Arabian Nights. We also give them the option to play with more events, with less events, with, you know. So we give the player a lot of freedom. However, for example, in campaigns, like Kyle was saying, and scenarios that we have, these are restrictions. Everything has a beginning and an end. They can break things in the middle, that's fine, but there's just going to be an end to the campaign. So all roads will lead to Rome eventually, by design.
Yeah, well, because we have to sit in the same galaxy for the whole game, and the story, the overarching story, just absolutely needs a few factions to be actually like happening with. So we divided the factions of the galaxy to 3 like groups. The first group, very small group, is the factions the player actually cannot touch in the early part of the game. Later on, they get the decision to do so, but like there's a big boundary. They are off limits to the player. Then the a bit bigger middle section is like the factions that have a side quest with them. So the player, when they encounter them, we actually quickly give them the option to start the side quest before they can like destroy that faction, and then they can either decide to take up the side quest and then follow that, or ignore that and just do whatever they want with that faction. And then the biggest part is the factions that don't have anything except like single events, but nothing bigger, and they are like free, absolutely free for the player to do what they want with. So we had to like pick the places where we will need boundaries for the player, but try to retain as much of freedom as possible, because like for X-Paint games especially are very sandbox like in their nature. So we felt bad putting up boundaries in there, so we did that as little as possible, but we had to do it a little bit.
I have found with players are like, if you don't tell them that the boundaries are there, they often don't realize the boundaries are there, which is maybe I don't know, it's a secret that we're telling on this recording, but I've been surprised like how well game design works sometimes, where like you can really pull the rug on players and they have no idea. So I think that's been like a tool that I've been trying to become more comfortable with using. Like a really simple example it is on topic a little bit, which is like specifically how our AI works. I tried really hard because like I play strategy games. I'm like, I don't want the AI to cheat. AI cheating's bad. You know, we don't want AI to cheat. But then like what was happening is people were playing the game and they would see AI players and they would attack them. And then they'd go to our like feedback forum and say like, it's so I attack the AI and they don't attack me back. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's because they can't see you. So like theoretically, the AI is just playing by the rules. They're being attacked by a force they can't see. They're not aggroed yet. So we can solve that in different ways, but like they shouldn't just come for you when they attack you. Turns out, if you just make it where the AI just comes for the player when that's like attacking them, that feels fine. The player like it's so this is like it's such a strategy game thing. Right? And this is like it was a huge deal in like XCOM when Jake Solomon came out saying like actually, if it's a 70% chance to hit, it's actually a 100% chance to hit on the math side, because the player wants to have this sort of privileged experience, which is definitely like kind of a weird thing in strategy games where, especially Layla, you're talking about like board games, right? Like you're in the mindset that everyone is on the same playing field. It's like, but actually the player does want to have a privileged experience in some way where the map like kind of revolves around them. So even in Cantata at the very start, when we first shipped the game, like we had the AI players doing kind of like Old World or Civ or Total War. The AI would like do stuff if you couldn't see it, and it like drove players mad. They were like, "Why are they doing it? Like, what is the AI doing?" And it's like, well, they're taking their turn. Like they're like, no, I'm playing right now. I'm not around them. I don't see them. I don't want to like. So that was like a funny thing to kind of realize, like, oh, there's a sort of with this like gating thing is that you can sort of do things that are very player centric that feel like giant hammers from a design side, but then from the player perspective, it's just don't even realize it, which has been yeah, little game dev secret there.
Yeah,
Speaking of, go ahead, Jackson. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. No, I talked.
I was just going to comment on the AI cheating aspect. It's almost useless to tell people the AI isn't cheating, because back in the day when we were making Off-World Trading Company, I was playing Off-World all the time, of course, and just collecting data and going back with design with Soren. And every time I go, and I'm kind of unofficially on the team, and I'm convinced that the AI is cheating, because every time I play the game in a specific way and I abuse the game to my benefit, to my advantage, one of my favorite games, it changes. The game changes. And little did I know that Soren is sitting behind me, watching me play all the time, and he's tweaking the game. So I changed I really changed where I sat, and I never played a game again. No, really, I'm that competitive with Off-World.
It's really no, that's hilarious. It's funny talking about that, because that's, despite having played Wildermyth probably, hopefully more than most people have, the thought that the AI was cheating wasn't something I really asked myself initially. And now that I'm thinking about it, in most ways, our AI is on the exact same playing field as you, in that like basically, so first enemy sees you. If they get their turn, if you don't kill them fast enough, they have an ability called Alarm, where they can basically tell the other enemies, "Hey, come towards me." But even those enemies, they don't have you in their line of sight. They have a specific line of sight, and if they don't see you, they'll look around and try to search for you. So I had never actually thought about, that it's actually really fair. We never tell our players like, "Oh yeah, no, they're on the same playing field as you," and we never say they're cheating, but fact that they are kind of on the same playing field, and they're like the real strength of the monsters is in their numbers. And that's when having played the game, when it's really hard, that's when it gets really difficult, is when you only have 5 people and there's only a certain number of actions you can take on your turn. They have 20 monsters, and their only limit is how well they can surround you. And so the game really does kind of change on the higher difficulties in that way. But that's funny. I never thought.
So is this, so I think, related back to a previous question you had, Jaakko, about like not only what is like difficult, but like I don't know, like specifically about like narrative on maps. Because I think kind of unlike Wildermyth, maybe more like Wildermyth, a little less like Old World, like our narrative does kind of exist on the map, right? Where it's like this location, you go here, and then this thing happens, and it looks different, and it's whatever. So like there's an issue, kind of like what Jackson and Layla are talking about a little bit, where like it's almost like the maps are kind of these elaborate like experiential, I don't know, it's not like Sleep No More or something, but it's like these people are basically ready to like put on a show for you when you reach them. And so they're not like actually playing the same game as you, which we only realized after we did a campaign. It's that they're kind of performing strategy for you when you encounter them, because if they're playing the game, what happens is that, so we have these big maps, right? And so if they're playing the game like Jackson or Layla's AIs would like play the game, that AI in those instances wants to win, right? That AI wants to beat the player. But for us, what that would mean is that, so if we gave the AI vision, so to speak, of all of its units, what happens is that we set up our elaborate map that it's got all these narrative beats, and you have to encounter them. You press go, and then one AI player or one AI unit sees one of your units, and the whole map drifts to come to you, because all those players, that what they want to do is kill you, right? They're like, oh, I want to win, I want to kill that person, I'm out of position, I need to go over here. So again, game dev tip, we basically in all the maps have these little like trigger flags where we actually kind of activate the map as you kind of reach other parts of it, because otherwise this thing happens where like the whole map just comes to try to attack you, which is like funny, but it makes it where like obviously that's like a bad experience, because then all these little, you have empty sets on the whole map where everybody left because they went to go attack you. So this area where there's supposed to be this like encounter with these enemies, those enemies all like left to go attack you. So that's like a weird thing that we had to deal with for like tempo and like ensuring that a narrative is told, is that the AI and like the people you're playing against, at least in the campaign mode, are like not really playing the game. They're sort of like pantomiming playing the game, and they're only playing it like a little bit, which has been a hard balance to strike and has been fun and exciting to discover.
Yeah, we had a bit similar kind of problem because Expedition starts with the player jumping into the galaxy with like basically one unit, and the story starts from there. But the galaxy is already full of the other factions, and they're actually quite big already. And of course, there's at some point there comes a point where the player can just like play that much better than the AI, that they can beat basically anyone they want to eventually. But if they start with one unit and the AIs are already in like the free mode that they do whatever they want, and oh, that faction looks a bit weak, it has only one unit. So it was a bit too harsh beginning for the players. So we ended up doing something like the first factions have like they act a bit differently in the beginning, and the rest that the player doesn't see, they have just like their brains plucked off for a while until the player gets a bit bigger and encounters them, and then they suddenly come alive.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, it's basically the same thing for us.
I'm a
See,
terrible player. Just don't tell me what are the cheating keys. Like in Civilization, I would hit Control W and go World Builder, and he does like, I have a plan to make my farms and build like I just don't want anybody to interfere with my plan. If they attack me, Control W, unit. I'm terrible, just awful.
I play
Yeah.
4X games the exact same way. I'm like, no, I just want to build my little empire. Just don't poke me. It's gonna be fine. It's funny talking about that issue of having one and then all the enemies kind of glom to it. We had a lesser version of that with Wildermyth, where so we have two maps. We have the overland map, which is kind of 4X-y tile type things, and then we have the combat maps, which tend to be kind of like almost like amalgamations of what we say exists on a tile. So if there's a forge, we'll have, a little forge building, and then maybe places you can't reach, you can see like, oh, there's like an anvil over here, that kind of thing. So almost kind of like just more of giving the player a vibe than an exact location. And part of my job was making a fair number of these, and so a lot of our maps are proc gen. But for campaigns especially, and kind of sites, we have specific maps that are handmade. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to make these maps, and they're going to have lots of like environmental storytelling. There's going to be like a bookshelf over here by a bed, and like, oh, it's going to be great. And then the problem is there's a straight path that the players go on, and as soon as the first monster sees that player, they call out to the other monsters, and all of them just come. So it becomes this thing of, really, you're not playing on the full map, you're playing on the like 10 tiles where everyone's standing. And so trying to figure out ways around that so players could see the beautiful map I'd spent time on was kind of an issue. It was like, okay, so, and you can do some of it by like gating with doors, and that was really helpful, but monsters can break through doors. So you have to kind of figure out the tempo that a fight is going to play at. And of course that changes based on the player. But that was an interesting challenge of like, okay, fighting on the same 8 tiles is not fun. How can this actually work?
Well, all right. I think it actually looks like we are getting over the 1 hour. Well, it's not the limit, but like it looks like we are going to have to end this discussion soon. It's been very fun and very interesting and educative as well. And so thank you for watching this discussion, and check out all the other discussions that are in this year's TactiCon, and check out all the games, and especially check out the Old World and Cantata and Wildermyth and Pegasus Expedition if you're like interested in anything that we will talking about here today. Yeah, thank you.
See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, y'all. Great meeting everyone.